Welcome today. My name is Caitlin Ryan, and I'm the executive director here at the Cannabis Alliance. And today we are talking about cannabis as agriculture. It's a really very broad topic. And I want to point out before we get too far into the conversation that here at the Cannabis Alliance, we're dedicated to the advancement of a vital, ethical, equitable, and sustainable cannabis industry. I want to thank you all for being willing to take some time on your Valentine's Day. I don't know if anybody has any awesome plans. I have a household of 4 kids, which means I'm really grateful when this day is over. It's a lot of paper projects we got to do. So actually delighted to be talking instead about agriculture today. I'm going to, let's see, turn it over to you all to introduce yourselves, and then we'll sort of just jump right on into it. Micah, do you mind starting us off?
Hi, everybody. I'm Micah Sherman. I'm one of the owners and founders of Raven. We're a tier 2 farm in the Olympia area. I'm also on the board of the Washington Sun and Craft Growers Association. And we helped found the National Craft Cannabis Coalition, which is a coalition of trade groups around the country that represent predominantly small-scale cannabis producers in the licensed space. Thanks. Glad to be here to talk about the agricultural aspects of what we do.
Thanks, Micah. Jessica.
My name is Jessica Tanani. We have a research license in the 502 space. We research the genetics of plants and how we get them to do things that people might want, be it produce different cannabinoids, flower at different times, be resistant to disease. We also have a separate company that has a hemp license, and due to regulatory issues, we had to separate that. But I think it's pretty interesting. In general, we just look at the plant and as a single plant, and whether it produces THC or not is kind of the designating factor for us on whether it's within the 502 or not.
Thank you. Tricia.
Hello, I'm Tricia Ehrlich. I am the Cannabis Programs Manager at the Washington State Department of Agriculture. I manage our hemp program as well as all of the many ways in which we touch cannabis, our cannabis accreditation standards program. I oversee cannabis budgets, policy, all sorts of things. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And then Ryan.
Good afternoon. I'm Ryan Agnew. I'm an attorney. I work with producers, processors, retailers, and been involved in the industry since the early days. Well, not early enough for some, but 2014.
Awesome. Thank you. I want to start today. The purpose of this conversation was actually to be more broad than what is immediately happening within the legislature, but I think that's probably a good jumping off point for our conversation here today. We have a couple of pieces of legislation that are still moving forward that address the agricultural practices, as well as a couple that have died that I think are really going to be important to the conversation that we're going to have here today. But first, the ones that are still moving. Just yesterday, the Cannabis Commission has left the Senate. It voted out. It was pretty much a vote along party lines, and will probably be referred to regulated substances and gaming, just as it was last year. There was an amendment put on it yesterday that there was previously in the bill gave guidance on how the fee, the assessment was going to be taken, the amount, as well as when, where, and how, and all of that sort of thing. And after some good conversations over the interim, we put in an amendment to make that actually a part of the rulemaking process. So one of the things that was a little bit confusing yesterday, I think, for senators is this bill doesn't actually establish a research commission or a commodities commission. It just allows farmers to vote on whether or not they want one. And then once that happens, it goes through a full rulemaking process with the WSDA. And then I think there's even yet one more step in there after that. So this is just the opportunity to get started on it. There are, I think, still some challenges. Unfortunately, the referendum is at 40%. Most special elections come in at about 30%, and every other Cannabis Commission that's been established prior to this has always been at a 30%. A majority of 30%. I'm kind of curious, what are some thoughts what are your thoughts on the Cannabis Research Commission? Is this a good thing? Ryan, I know you were in on the early days of getting this going.
Personally, I'd like to see marketing included. That was one of the cons. They said, "Hey, what good is a commission if we can't do marketing?" But then we can't do marketing if we can't have interstate commerce. So I don't think they're necessary. They're mutually exclusive. There was some initial pushback as to whether or not something that is federally illegal should be allowed to advertise in other states. But I think that the commission itself represents a variety of bonuses for producers and processors, especially research probably being top of the list. But on that 40% threshold, I mean, this is the compromise I think that was wanted. I don't know all the ins and outs of how the bill made it through this year, but it sounds like the opposition before was, well, the producers and processors don't have enough buy-in in this process. So, okay, well, why don't we put it to a vote? Having at least 40% of all the licensees vote, it gives us a little bit of time, assuming this gets signed into law, it gives people time to lobby the licensee, so to speak, in order to get the requisite. I mean, you have to have at least 40% of all licensees participate, who then have to pass it by at least 51%. So that's essentially two thresholds. I'm optimistic. And I guess a final note, something I like about the commission is that if you compare it to other commissions, another thing that they do is they're actually one of the primary, I don't want to call them lobbyists, but they usually have a presence in Olympia almost year round. And so anytime a policymaker or a member of the legislature needs information or needs to be updated on something, the commissions themselves are one of the first places that they can go to for a somewhat unbiased and nuanced view on anything. So it's not, I like that we're going to have, I mean, there's still a handful, 5, 6, 7, 8 groups, including the Alliance, that advocate for certain positions, and yet we all have our own biases. I think a commission would be the least biased of those, at least compared to how other commissions operate. So I think that would be a substantial benefit when it comes to advocating for cannabis policy statewide moving forward. So I hope it passes. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
It's
Anybody else have thought? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I was on the work group or task force, I don't know what we were called, to figure out whether there should be a hemp commission. And one of the things that I found was super interesting is when you go out and you talk to people in other established agricultural markets, cherries, hops, grapes, all of them are willing to kind of participate in a commission and see the value in it because of the value that it's brought to them and being able to sell their goods and services long term. And I think, Ryan, you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said, I think the biggest pushback I've heard is the inability to do marketing within the commission. And I think that's the major pushback. And I think that, one of the things that I would like to see as a state that people start to look at is what's the 3, 5, 10-year plan for this plant moving forward in the state. And, hopefully somebody like a commission could help to kind of put that together because there are very different and conflicting issues. But I think we have to realize that we're a fairly small state competing in a fairly large market. And I don't think we necessarily have a plan for how we're going to compete long-term in that market. And as marketing and things come online, if we don't have a plan, our state may no longer be as relevant as we would like it. But I'll let other people comment on that.
Micah, do you have a thought?
I have a lot of thoughts about commission and the sort of political process that's got up around it. And, just at the outset of the conversation, I think the idea of a commission is really well intentioned and that the existence of one done well could be a real benefit to licensees on the production side. My concerns and our organization's concerns about the particular versions of the bill that have existed I think are may varied, right? The bill's been different over the years and sort of how it's been positioned. And I think this version of the bill, where it does kind of put us into this process of like rulemaking and deliberation, is a good approach. My only concern is that we don't create like a sort of inordinate hurdle in the rulemaking and petitioning process that maybe even puts us like in a more difficult position than trying to pass a bill that was more fine-tuned and agreed upon. So I know that there's this concession to this process in order to get the bill passed, but then I worry a little bit that maybe it's harder to go through that process than pass a bill in the future. And so that's my only concern about where it might sit. Because I do think that like conceptually it's a good idea. I think we talk about a commodity commission a lot, and one thing that I have tried to introduce into this conversation is like our market structure as the Washington cannabis industry is not necessarily a commodity market. And so all of us on the production side don't necessarily have a commodity producer's view of the marketplace because it actually doesn't function as a commodities market. And that like kind of has a really specific qualities to a commodities market where you have homogeneity and both on quality, grades, and price, right? So that's what kind of puts everybody in the same position, and so they can work collectively towards their interests. We don't really have that market structure because of the nature of cannabis prohibition and limited licensing, and so there's limitations to what a commodity commission can do as far as accurately representing everybody's interests collectively because we have a fragmented production models. And so that's a barrier that we're all going to have to deal with in this eventually, because we're always going to be sort of a commodity / specialty ag production model where brands matter a lot and lots of other factors besides the commodity considerations matter. So how the commission can both represent that small scale brand focused production, which is going to be really valuable to our local economy, and then also start to think about how do we build like an ecosystem where that sort of production and ag commodity production can sort of work together to make like our business models as brands and sort of the small businesses we are now, and then build out the rest of the industry in a way that's focused on export. Because I do think we have like a lot of export potential as a state. We have some really great places to grow weed, and we can do it really successfully, and we have the expertise, and we have the distribution networks, and all of us, like what we've been doing all these years, like we've built the scaffolding for all of that to like take uproot in, and but being real considerate about like how market structure positions us to make these choices is going to be, I think, the next level of like making the commission work.
Yeah, Micah, one of the groups that I didn't realize had a commission was the brewers, which I think is somewhat analogous to what you're saying, where, like if you think about across like brewing beer, there's drastic differences and, acknowledgement that there's different levels, different qualities, different brands within there, but that you may have similar interest in export or coming together as a market.
Yeah. And then Tricia, I don't know if you can speak to this piece of it, but commissions historically are actually very difficult to establish. The fact that this has already been a multi-year process may take some more additional effort. Can you talk about, traditionally what those timelines look like?
So I can't say, my career, as many of you know, has really been in cannabis. So I can't speak so much to the traditional agricultural process as far as timelines. They are typically quite lengthy. And they are often pioneered by companies that are already doing international or very big, across the United States or North America work, right? So they often have a few pioneers who are in pretty big business that are able to move things along. I will say, I think piggybacking off of a lot of what Micah said, I think one of the most unique kind of timeline challenges is part of what makes cannabis so special is also what makes this difficult. A history of an illegal culture means that folks were forced to have very private business models, which means that they now have very diverse business models. So if you go into like cranberries, beer, grapes, cherries, you don't see a ton of diversity in the business models when you compare it to, every cannabis farm I've been to is doing their own thing, kind of. Same with the processors, same with the labs, even same with the retailers. And so that is really a challenge, especially when you start to think about the goals of the commission. People always say like there's not enough research in cannabis, which I think is kind of a cop out. I think there's like a ton of research. It's just so multimodal and diverse and going in 10 billion different directions and intentions that it can be really hard to sort through. And I think, the diversity of these cannabis businesses and their different research interests, even in the scope of the bill, production and processing, manufacturing of products, and the amount of kind of research controversies just within manufacturing, testing methods, worker protection, safety training, energy efficiency, environmental protection. Those are really ambitious goals that I don't think are as embedded into traditional agriculture and traditional agricultural commissions. So that's my 2 cents.
Gotcha. Yeah, which sort of then makes this exciting and challenging, and all of those things at the same time, because that level of diversity in a lot of ways is, I think, our superpower, right? Because there are lots of ways to be resilient when you have lots of different ways of looking at it. But then that, of course, makes it that much more challenging when you're trying to pull all of these very different looking threads together and moving it towards one common goal, and that is survival, which a lot of producer processors are on the brink of not doing right now. And you talked about those more well-established pioneers. Obviously, nobody's doing anything out of state for them, beyond our state borders. But the ones that were very well capitalized, had good market share early on, and for a long time, are also now starting to voice real existential concern about whether or not they're even going to stay in Washington state, if that's their method of survival, or if perhaps closing down is what's necessary. And so excited to keep working, moving forward. For me, the real important piece of the commission, about getting it started, is that piece that you brought up, Micah, around interstate commerce. We'll talk also about hemp and how that exact same plant and 2 regulatory realities is causing some really interesting policy questions right now. And the idea that currently right now, the official voice of cannabis in Washington state is the Liquor and Cannabis Board, and that's it, really does not feel good from the industry side of things. And a commission would be another official voice for the state of Washington as we're having negotiations with the federal government and possibly with additional states as we start exploring interstate commerce as well. Which, by the way, is coming. I know that governor's offices are talking here in the West right now. We're about to see that letter go to the Department of Justice asking for an opinion, and that's pretty exciting, as all things are in that federal level. The other piece of legislation that just got out of the House, I'm not sure, Tricia, has it been referred yet? I think to Labor and Commerce, is the lab accreditation. Department of Ecology was to be heading that up in this multi-year process between, it's called CLASP now. It was the interagency team. There was also, even previous to that, another group with full stakeholder engagement on this. And then here in the 11th hour, Ecology kind of said, we don't really have the capacity to do that. And so I want to thank the Department of Agriculture for being willing to take that on. Otherwise, if this bill doesn't go through, it's bad news bears for everybody, right? We may have a backup of testing. Can you talk more about why this bill is so important?
Yeah. And, I was looking at your question about the service gap there. So I actually think the service gap issue is the smallest issue when it comes to the accreditation process. So for those who want a little background, basically right now, labs are audited and recommended for accreditation by a third-party consultant with the LCB, the RJ Leak Group. And since 2017, 2018, there's been a movement to kind of enhance the integrity of cannabis testing in Washington by bringing some of those services in state and increasing the standards that the labs have to operate under. And so we have written a rule to increase those standards and enhance the integrity of the laboratories. The next step is then to audit to that standard. Ecology has made it clear that they will not be prepared to start July 1, 2024. However, my understanding is that the LCB did extend the contract with RJ Lee Group through December 31st of this year. So there is overlap time. But I don't think it would be a situation where products aren't getting tested. Products will continue to get tested. We still have to discuss what that service gap would look like. It would probably just be continue on the RJ Lee path, hopefully not beyond December 31st. As someone who has had to hire chemists and microbiologists and train them and get them a part of your organization and get them to know your stakeholders, that can be a lengthy process, but I can't speak to what ecology will look like in that. What I can say, we also, the Department of Agriculture, intend to provide laboratories with 6 months to get up to code on the new standard. We're anticipating an effective date of May 17th, and we want to give laboratories to December 31st. But what I think is bigger than the service gap issue is that the Department of Ecology will be doing a fee-based program, about $65,000-ish a year for our labs. Why that impacts producer processors, because some of that cost would likely get passed down onto you. It also means that it's quite possible some of our labs will not be able to stay in business, not because of the quality of their testing, but because of the ability of their ability to pay that $65K. We want to see good labs stay in business. If a lab is not able to meet standards, that's when they should leave, not because they don't have $65K, if that makes sense. And then I guess my final concern is that the ecology plan is charging that $65K. If there is lab attrition, they still have to fund a program, which means that fee would go up. And they're only planning for 1.5 FTEs, one chemist and a half of a microbiologist. WSDA currently has 2 chemists and a full microbiologist, plus program manager and further administrative support. It's taken everything we've got to get this standard together. Constant hours, tons of conversations with labs and stakeholders. It is hard to imagine how auditing to this complex a standard could happen with 1.5 while supporting the labs and trying to create a culture of compliance and education where we have the time to have the conversation like, this is what's missing, this is what we need, how can we make this work? So I would say this service gap is actually the least of my concerns, but we feel that our laboratories are a public health and environmental health necessity in this state, and they need to be publicly funded like one. So the answer to us is funding a team that can do the audits.
And I think, Tricia, that fee cannot be like understated. You know, when you look at I think to this point, we have the most expensive license in the state of Washington, a research license. And ours is, 10% of that kind of situation. If you think about your producer processors that have, quite frankly, the ability to potentially have larger revenue streams than some of our labs, that fee is insane. And as Tricia said, if we go from, I think there's 8 labs now, is that right? 8-ish?
Yeah.
If we go down to 6, then that 65,000, which is now 130,000, gets on the backs of the 6 remaining labs. So that fee goes up, and it's truly just going to be a trickle down situation where your lab testing goes from $75 to $150 to $250, and I think it will make people do less R&D samples. I think this is an integrity system. All of our products are based upon the fact that we believe the test results should be accurate. And I think that there's active debate around the years on how accurate they are. But at the end of the day, if we believe that, then we have to fund that and make sure that the labs are accurate and have the resources they need. I think it's probably the most important bill out there. I know there's some controversy with me saying that, but I think it is the most important bill for the industry right now.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say this before we sort of move on to another component to this, one that should be just moving very smoothly without any issues. And in particular, that lab fee part almost popped up in the appropriations, enough so that we're keeping a really close eye on it. So that should that come up again, and now that it's going to be moving over to the Senate, that we're prepared and really watching it very closely, because yeah, it's untenable. That one's untenable.
Yeah.
So we're starting to get all kinds of comments rolling in. Another piece of legislation that did not make it out of policy committee. It was not expected to make it out of policy committee because it sort of speaks to something that is both totally just accepted and wildly controversial at the same time, if you can imagine, here in Washington state, and that is that we do not consider adult use cannabis agriculture here in Washington state. For those of us that were around in the beginning, that felt really awful. I was involved in some local challenges around that designation and took it through a couple of court cases at a lower level. And ultimately, the law is very explicit. Cannabis is not agriculture. Ryan, can you talk a little bit about why that is? And
Sure. Former Senator Reuben Carlisle made it one of his centerpieces of his office to cut down on what he saw as tax loopholes. And so when I-502 passed, one of the first things he did was carve out cannabis from any sort of agricultural deductions that are normally applicable to other people engaged in agricultural activities. Now, while that should have been just narrowly confined to tax deductions, other state agencies and local government interpreted that to mean that cannabis is not agriculture across the board. When Oregon legalized a couple years later, or not long after, Oregon went out of their way to say cannabis is an agricultural activity. So I think it was a twofold mistake on Washington's part. The lack of foresight to state in the initial legislation that it was ag, but also this presumption that just because it lacks any sort of tax benefits, that across the board, then in like a nuisance applications, for example, that it's also not an agricultural activity. And that's important when it comes to nuisance, because if you are ag, then you have what's known as traditional right to farm protections. And it's a much, much harder case for a neighbor or a local government to say that this is a nuisance activity. So because of Reuben's legislation, and he wasn't opposed to efforts to redefine nuisance and define cannabis as an agricultural activity, it has yet to have the momentum to put that over the top, because now there's a number of people opposed to it in one form or another. But and that's the origins. It was supposed to be just in taxes, and now it's not ag across the board.
Ryan, do you think, we jumped off on a limb here 10 years ago too. And at the time, WSDA had a lot of federal funding. They still do. And there was kind of this idea also that housing everything under the LCB would provide some protection from pulling federal dollars. And I think we've obviously progressed from that standpoint. But do you think anything along that line also played into this, where things like the farming regulation fell in the LCB and not maybe under WSDA or, other agencies?
Yeah, initially, what are the feds going to do seemed to be used as an excuse, as sort of a catch-all anytime some sort of policy decision was made, like, oh, by the way, we're doing this just to conform with the Cole memo. And then by the time the U.S. Senate did their study as to whether or not the DEA or anybody else checked to see whether coal was being aligned, any of those 8 priorities. That there's actually no mechanism to check if states were compliant with it. By the time we found out that the coal memoranda didn't really matter anymore, and that states were going to be allowed to do their own thing, we still use that as an excuse, but it was already too late. It was so much damage had already been done under the guise of, oh well, we don't want to piss off the feds here, right? Or we don't want to lose our federal funding. Like, even though none of that came to pass, it was too far gone at that point. But I don't disagree at all that that was an initial concern. I just it was usually used after the fact to substantiate some poor policy decision, mostly on the LCB side. Nothing against the WSDA, but yeah, definitely, I think that was a factor.
And I'll share, I've had some conversations. So the piece of legislation that I'm referring to was brought forward by Representative Reeves, and it was to bring regulatory authority of production under WSDA and away from LCB. And in preparation for that bill getting a hearing, I did have some conversations with LCB, and the answer was still really, Jessica, right along those lines. Well, this is a controlled substance. Therefore, it should be regulated by the Liquor and Cannabis Board. I did a little bit of a deep dive to look at other states and see what regulatory setup most other states have. And we're actually fairly unique. I think also, Jessica, is really important to point out that, yeah, those early days, it's hard to remember now because this moved so fast. But those first couple of years, really, truly, nobody had any idea what was going to happen. I remember talking to a lawyer friend of mine, and I was like, okay, so like, what's the worst that could happen? And he said, well, they can take your kids, they can take all of your assets and throw you in jail for the rest of your life. I went, so but is that going to happen? Or he's like, I mean, probably not, but you need to know that that is very real and could absolutely happen. And now we know that's nobody's in fear of that anymore at all whatsoever. And so, but what is really painful now is that all of those decisions that were made, Ryan, just like you said, under that sort of feeling, none of that has been addressed or changed or assessed or, and we're sort of at a moment in time now too, where again, when I looked at all of those regulatory models, we're only one of about 3 or 4 that are solely under combined with liquor and tobacco, and sometimes gaming even. Most states actually have an agency uniquely for cannabis explicitly, and that's not just adult use cannabis, but that's most frequently adult use, medical, and I would like for us to now start talking about hemp. So everything having to do with the plant in one regulatory house that's a little bit separate from sort of vices or controlled substances and agriculture. Trisha.
Yeah, I would just say, in thinking about Reeves's bill, obviously I spent a lot of time staring at it because people were asking me how much it would cost. And I was like, I don't know. So, I think I see a comment here in the early days. WSDA was notably hands-off of cannabis in the first days of 502. I think that is fairly accurate. I think, there was a lot of cultural concern from traditional agricultural kind of tides that I think has evolved quite a bit within the agency. I joined the agency in 2020, and I think that there's a lot of openness, but I think, for example, looking at the Reeves bill, I'm looking at how we would transfer assets. It was just kind of written out as a complete transfer of assets. And I would love to see a proviso that would allow us to really, because there's the intent and there's the heart and then there's the money. So, in conversations that I've had around social equity in the past, it was very much embedded in, we do not need guns to go to farms, right? And the WSDA does not have guns. But then I looked at this bill and I said, are they going to give us the guns? What does that look like? We hire agricultural inspectors, not enforcement agents, different levels of training, different levels of pay. So what we haven't had is the opportunity to link up the heart and the intent with the financial implications. And I certainly couldn't do it in a fiscal note. I was really pleased when that got canceled from a like doing my job this week perspective, but I would love a year to flesh it out. I think that is a really big missing piece in figuring out what it would look like to have production have a home at WSDA in the future. Would be, right now we've got $30 million in federal contracts. So a little bit of a risk I don't think we'd be willing to take, but maybe in a year or 2 years or 3 years, we don't know when, but understanding how the heart meets the money, I think would be really helpful to really think about what would it look like to do a reorg that would incorporate this and provide funding for it, and maybe not fund the parts we don't want anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Trisha, one of the things that I think we've seen like in Pennsylvania and Ohio and things like that is the requirement that groups that have federal funding participate in, especially the medical systems. It was in Pennsylvania a requirement of this of getting a license that you had a collaboration with one of the, I think it was 8 or 9 universities that all had public, and federal funding. And so I think, it's one of those things that we set up our rules very differently. And I think it's also part of a much larger discussion of what did we do in 502 10 years ago, especially impacting the universities or the agencies that we deal with, and how could we look at what other states have done and the lack of ramifications and maybe progressively step by step kind of rechange the things that we think are worth changing.
I like everything that's been said so far on this topic, and would just add that we fundamentally need to go back and basically reevaluate everything that we do and rebuild it in the light of the world that we live in now in 2024. So we've already legalized cannabis nationally, but only the hemp kinds. Sometimes the plants I'm growing, they're hemp, and then one day they become cannabis. And we've changed the definition of cannabis legally because it used to be called marijuana. And then we put those two things together and we created a new legal definition for cannabis. Our rules don't align with that new definition of cannabis. We have all sorts of references in our rules to an old definition for marijuana, and this now references this new definition for cannabis, and they no longer make sense with the reality of the world and the reality of our legal definitions. Our rules are largely incoherent. They're not understood by anybody, us, enforcement, the board, nobody. And so we're now in this situation where a lot of what's happening is based on sort of people's different ideas about things that may or may not have a basis in what's real. And we're all operating in that reality every day. And we see it, online with hemp products that call themselves THCA that are just the same exact things we're all selling. And, there's contradictions and issues abound, both like locally and nationally. And the next couple of years is going to be about how do we reconcile all of that and get to something that makes any sense of coherence. And in order to do that, we have to reconcile the fact that in my operation right now, I transitioned through, something that's legally defined as hemp to something that's legally defined as cannabis. And there's like there's not a hard line in between when it becomes one and the next. And those sorts of things are what we're operating in. And so it's almost like we have to go back and relook at all this stuff and decide like, all right, what's a control issue? What's a production issue? What's a manufacturing issue? Who's best suited to help us do that well and do that to the best of our capacities as an industry? And it's obviously a hybrid of the WSDA and the LCB. And so then the real question becomes, like Teresa talked about, how do we make sure that like the right things are getting moved around so that people don't get concerned about potentially, controlled products that need to be age gated getting into the hands of somebody that's not, because at this point, that's our main concern with controls, right? It's making sure that people are paying their taxes and kids don't get our products.
Mm-hmm.
The other concerns that shaped a lot of this conversation have fallen in by the wayside, and they aren't as big of a concern. And so, like, how do we spend the interim between now and the next legislative session working between these agencies to make sure that all of these sorts of questions get answered, and we can really satisfyingly say, like, this is the purview of the WSDA, this is the purview of the LCB, and this is all the stuff that we let fall by the wayside because it's incoherent. And if we do that project really well, we're all going to be in such a better place in a lot of different ways, because like operationally our lives will get easier. Our ability to sort of interact coherently with the rest of the world that's happening right now. And like, how do we answer these questions about like, how does Washington intersect with what's going on nationally? How do we prepare ourselves for export? How do we have coherent regulatory structures so we know who's talking to who in these interstate conversations? And like, there's a lot to be done. The rule writing process at the LCB has ground to a halt. Nothing is happening. Nothing is happening. And it hasn't for years. And so like, everybody needs help. Everybody needs to do a better job. Everybody needs to step it up. And that's like the reality that we're in. It's like, we all need to do everything we can to make sure that the resources and knowledge is available so that those folks can do what we need them to do and not have it be quite so difficult. And like, that's really, you know, it's easy to say and it's hard to do, but like, I feel like that's our project, is like, how do we make sense of all of this, come together and realize that none of us have everything we need to do it perfectly. That is true whether or not we change anything or not. And we need something to be pretty different in order for this to become sustainable and for us to be well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of us. Because right now, we're not.
I think you're right, especially Micah, in the sense that we need to look at like what is going on nationally and actually get a good handle for what's going on in other states, because I think that there's an oftentimes tendency to kind of look at like what's going on, the dynamics that are going on in the state. And, you know, I kind of feel like sometimes we're at a family barbecue arguing with our cousins and we don't realize like the neighbors are coming down the street. And, you know, of course we like rallied as a family and go after the neighbors, but we don't even know that they're like coming because we're like so in the discussion with our family members. But maybe that's not a fair analogy. I don't know.
No, I think that's a really fair analogy. Apologies, you saw me. I had a teenager wander through here for a second. But yeah, there's so much there. And let's just call it, if we can, let's describe what exactly is happening right now. Speaking back to, you know, all of these concerns we had about federal government interference, now we're in a really interesting place that following the Farm Bill, it's taken a little bit of time, but somewhere midsummer in 2023, some shift occurred and we started seeing quite a lot of material coming from hemp farms, not so much here in Washington state, but across the nation. And we're seeing a lot of manufacturing from other states entering. And the idea here being, and anybody jump in and correct me, this is my understanding, lots of conversations, right? The Farm Bill contemplates flower that is grown within the farm gate. It regulates that. It needs to be below that 0.3% THC 30 days prior to harvest. Each state has a flavor of that regulation. Here in Washington state, thankfully, we're pretty locked down about what that looks like. Other states, not so much. And then after it leaves there, the argument is, or after that test occurs, the argument is that anything that then is made from that flower is legal product. I've been on websites where it is COAs are offered along with that product. And if the state does not have a definition around THC that incorporates THCA as well as Delta 9 or total THC, that there's this argument that THCA flower can be sold as a hemp product under the Farm Bill. There is no, here in Washington state, we have some different definitions. So it kind of goes state by state. So I could see already, everybody's like, wait a second. No, I'm not getting that right. Okay, I'll interrupt myself. Correct me.
So what I would say is every state, this is where the confusion comes. There's two ways. I think there's two, I'll call loopholes, and one's not even a loophole. One's an enforcement issue. So everybody has to fall under a 30-day total THC rule. And that total THC is THCA times 0.87 plus THC. Every single state has to follow that. THCA flower is most likely never compliant, most likely never tested, and it is somehow brought into the system, and people are saying it is below 0.3% delta 9 and that THCA does not count, but THCA is within the rules that states have to follow. And Tricia, you can.
And I will add to that, that we are seeing an alarming number of false and fraudulent COAs that will even have, they'll put the total THC equation on the COA, but then still use the delta 9 number for total THC. And that is only aiding and abetting this process. But no, this THCA flower is not legal. It is just illicit cannabis crossing state lines.
I think. Sorry.
Well, which gets me to that other loophole that you mentioned, Jessica, which is that back when we were so afraid of the federal government, there is no authority or no enforcement arm from the federal government to do anything about it. I will tell you my conversations with attorneys general, with other folks who are regulating it here in Washington state, the answer that I am getting is unless it is manufactured within Washington state, there really isn't an appetite to go after the product that is coming in. That's up to the federal government under the Farm Bill. And there is no funding, no structure, no agency that is assigned to do that particular task.
But what I will say is that it does appear that a lot of this product and a lot of the laboratories are located in the state of California. And so it doesn't mean that other states can't push their regulators to do better, especially seeing as they have actually one of the most stringent laboratory standards. The people overseeing their laboratories should be making sure that these fraudulent COAs aren't acceptable. And that is one way to bottleneck this process.
So we're going to get super nerdy because up until yesterday, I would have said this really hasn't been tested in court anywhere. We don't have anything, but there was an announcement that there is now a RICO case in Georgia looking at exactly and the fraudulent lab activity, quote, the alleged fraudulent lab activity is a part of that case, as you're pointing out. I was trying to get really salient legal analysis by this podcast today. Everybody's still sort of reading it and digging into it. Anybody have any thoughts on, do we, if nothing else, what I did hear from the lawyers that I talked to from yesterday morning and to today is that we can expect to see a lot more of these cases now moving forward.
So the two things that I would say is that there's these two different product buckets, I'll say, that we're seeing out there. And there's other product buckets, but one is this THCA flower that is most likely never compliant. And then the second thing is this people taking compliant flower and, CBD, for example, and synthesizing it into other compounds. And I tell people this is very similar to like growing grapes and making wine out of it, or potatoes and making vodka. Like they're synthesizing things like Delta 8. And this case I thought was fairly interesting because it's about the Delta 8 synthetics. And there's a fairly that potentially is more of a loophole on closing that down and shutting it down. I defer to Ryan. But they're two very different things. There's this argument that once hemp, always hemp. But then there's these products that never begin as hemp that aren't being enforced. So I think we're seeing two very different pathologies out there, and the lack of enforcement, especially, Cookies was sued by their competitors in the state of California a month or two ago. And because nobody's enforcing. So they were turned in state and federally, nobody's enforcing. And so their competitors actually sued them for unfair business practices. And still THCA flowers being sold on the internet. So, I guess my take on that is there's two different products that we need to look at, and one of them is a straight up enforcement issue. I don't know if anybody.
Yeah,
Ryan?
I am pausing to see if anybody else wants to jump in on this one.
Georgia RICO is a bit easier to do than federal. So, they use it to prosecute all types of cases, including our former president.
Sure.
So that may be a handy way to do it, but it's probably unique to the Georgia statute. When it comes to downstream products, whether synthesized or otherwise, the fact that you can something that tests clean in that 30 days can be, concentrated, and there's no mechanism really to look at whether or not that concentration is somehow violates the Farm Bill. It just wasn't put in there, and so we've kept the 2018 language alive for yet another year until downstream products are addressed on top of what actually constitutes hemp. And the definition of hemp is just copy pasted for the last 30 years, 40 years. And so that original language, I don't think ever contemplated what you could do with it or what an isomer was or derivative. When people with the know-how get their hands on it. So yeah, there's 2, 3, 4 different things that a new Farm Bill will have to address. And yet, if there's not a local enforcement interest, then someone may very well find a new loophole. I'm not entirely optimistic about how that looks, but yeah, that's pretty wide open right now for sure. And if there is a few minutes left over, I'm wondering if we may want to touch on what rescheduling or descheduling looks like, because I used to be very bullish on how soon interstate commerce would occur. Right now, I'm not as convinced. The banking reform needs to happen, absolutely, for a variety of reasons. 280E reform needs to happen. I don't know that we see a rescheduling or descheduling happening, but only if we have a chance to dive into it.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to move to that. Honestly, I will say this: we are going to have our policy summit on May 10th, and that is this conversation is the subject for an entire day, and probably that full day is not going to be enough time to go through it, because really, truly, Micah, you really eloquently covered a lot of bases when you were talking earlier. That this hits lots of lanes all happening at the same time within the federal level. And then here in Washington, we're in dire straits, and we got to figure out how we are going to position ourselves moving forward. And so, yeah, one of the comments said, well, this will be fixed if it's rescheduled. I have a big feeling about that. It looks a lot like Jessica's. Ryan, you were the one who brought it up. What would you like to say about that?
Well, yeah, I'll just hopefully I could kick it off, but you're asking for recreational licensees, or I should say adult use licensees, to get on board with a regulatory system that is really designed for medical use. And without their buy-in, I don't think you have enough momentum to pressure members of Congress to reschedule or deschedule. Going around, I don't think descheduling is a starter anywhere, as much as cool as it would be. So if we're talking about rescheduling, we're still talking about falling under some medical use regulations. And how many adult use licensees do you know that want to have anything to do with do you really want to trust LCB or other agencies to now decide what types of adult use products fit under their own version of FDA guidelines? Like, what a mess. I don't know how those two things become congruent. So if we're rescheduling just for the purposes of regulating medical cannabis, then you really haven't addressed anything for the bulk of the marketplace.
Jessica?
I think the question I always ask people is if we're rescheduling to Schedule 3, I can't go and set up a local convenience store that sells codeine. Like that's the analogy of what we're asking to do in this market. And so, we have to realize that it would still be a Schedule 3, and what that enforcement looks like, I don't know. There may very well be no enforcement, but it is a Schedule 3 compound, and as much as, people might want to buy codeine from me, I couldn't go and set up a, codeine store and not expect some sort of enforcement.
You disappoint us, Jessica. Huh.
A codeine store sounds awful.
As with the NCCC, we've had quite a bit of activity in DC and have gotten a fair bit of information about sort of what this looks like. And so my position on the rescheduling thing is the only thing it does for sure is it moves us out of the realm of 280E, because 280E is explicitly called out for Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances only. We're going to get if rescheduling happens, we're going to get sans clear recommendations about what the FDA or the DEA is going to do. All of our businesses are going to remain in the same exact nebulous state that they do now, as far as our relationship with the federal government, with the exception of 280E no longer being applicable to what we're doing. So this would be the equivalent of if a state decided we do love codeine stores and we're going to make codeine stores. And if the federal government's going to come after us for it, we're going to fight them on it. And like, obviously that probably wouldn't happen, but that would be the scenario we would be likening to. So like, we're still going to be in this nebulous state of we're acting federally illegally, but we're not going to have the onerousness of 280E, and everything else is going to stay more or less the same. And the potential downstream risks are it could create a coalition of pharmaceutical companies that wanted to take the federal apparatus and turn it against us. I don't think that is going to happen, because I don't think either the DEA or the FDA has any interest in doing that whatsoever. And they're going to continue to punt, and they're going to say Congress needs to do something about this, and that this is more or less not going to change anything. It might give a few stock bros a little bit more incentive to like push on getting into some exchanges or something like that. We might see a little bit of that sort of activity, but I don't think substantially it by itself is going to be much of a change to anything in the short term. And it's more going to precede other actions that are going to need to happen either at the federal regulatory level, which would take like a bazillion years, or eventually Congress will die off and a new one will get formed and they might do something.
And you can fix 280 without rescheduling. I mean, yeah, one would do the other, but you could just modify what falls under 280 without moving it.
Certainly.
And then one thing that I would say is nobody's pushing the feds to enforce right now. There's no giant lobbying group like the pharmaceutical industry saying unfair business practices because these people are selling a drug that we can manufacture now. And so I would say, like, we kind of know the devil that we know, and nobody's pushing that group to come and enforce on our businesses. And so, I think the downstream risk is that we now all of a sudden end up with some active people, be it the alcohol industry, the pharmaceutical industry, other industries actively pushing for some sort of enforcement on the businesses, and that might not occur, but I would say that's a very real risk.
One thing I've learned is that none of these federal agencies have much in the way of enforcement capacity, and they do it mostly with the cooperation of state agencies and state level governments. And so that without that cooperation, they don't really have anybody to send to do anything. And so in these places where we continue to have contradiction between state and federal law around our adult use medical programs, that would be extremely unlikely without the formalization of pharmaceutical rules that would allow those businesses to actually provide those products in our markets, and then cooperation with the state agencies to say, you can't do that anymore, you can only do this. And I just see that as like a pretty unlikely scenario. Federal rule writing takes like a decade, and they don't want to. And at the end of the day, I think, and we have learned, I think, this in the state of Washington, like if a state agency wants to, or an agency wants to put its feet down and say, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
You kind of can't force it to happen. And they're experts at that.
I hope so. I mean, I hope that a pharmaceutical company doesn't come in and release a Schedule 3 drug because there's some in IND and then turn around and sue for unfair business practices or something like that. I mean, I think that those kind of things are what we have the risk of, is that, you know, somebody pushes agencies to enforce in a way we wouldn't want them to.
But if they go to Schedule 3 and do it without guidance and recommendation for a process to get it approved, then that's not a possibility, correct?
I think if it drops to Schedule 3 and you have an IND go through, like, for example, Teva's MS drug, that it affects the way that they manufacture. So they manufacture a little bit less stringent. They have a little bit easier distribution channels. But I don't think there necessarily needs to be specific rules around how they manufacture. But Ryan, you may know a little bit more about that.
Well, and I think this actually brings us to a good spot, Micah. Thank you for bringing it, you know, as we wandered off into that federal level, that you really nicely brought it back to the issue of state regulation and why it is so important that as this federal landscape continues to develop and develop fast in a couple of different lanes all at the same time, making sure our state regulatory bodies are set up to regulate us, this industry, as intelligently and comprehensively as possible, which is the whole point of this conversation. Is cannabis production is agriculture. I did, we're kind of at our time. I did also want to talk about, you know, ways that we might get there, but to be continued. We'll continue to talk about this. It's a really important and worthwhile conversation. I want to thank all of you for your time today to get into it. Does anybody, before we close it down, have any final thoughts? Any last thing that came up in this hour that you want to make sure you had a chance to comment on? There's so much, right? I know each of you, I have been on the phone sometimes for hours rolling this all around. I want to thank you again for your intelligence. Here at the Cannabis Alliance, we're dedicated to vital, ethical, equitable, and sustainable cannabis industry. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.